From PRI, Public Radio International in Los Angeles, I'm Tavis Smiley.
And from Princeton, I'm Cornell West, and this is Smiley and West. Later in the program, we'll be joined by my dear brother, Mumia Abu-Jamal. He's in a Pennsylvania prison where he's serving a life term. He was on death row until a year ago, and he's become known all around the world for his struggle for justice. I'll also be joined by Brother Steve Vittoria, the director of the new Mumia documentary, Long Distance Revolutionary.
That film premieres in a number of cities this month, in fact, and I happen to know that one Cornell West is featured in it, along with 3 previous guests on this program. In fact, Michelle Alexander, Alice Walker, and Dick Gregory.
Well, I'm very much blessed to be a part of this film. I tell you, can't wait for our dialogue on today's program.
We would not be who we are as African Americans of this day were it not for the Reverend, the prophet Nat Turner, who brilliantly merged the religious and the political, who didn't just talk about the world to come, but fought to transform the world that is.
We are so blessed to have one of the grand freedom fighters in the realm of the arts. His name is Brother Stephen Vittoria. He has given us a labor of love and a gift of art in this magnificent documentary, Long Distance Revolutionary. Brother Steve, it is a blessing to have you, though, man.
Thank you, Dr. West. I appreciate it.
Now, could you give our audience a sense of what went into the making of this film, your vision, your craft, the interviews? Give us a sense of the process.
Well, Mumia has been an inspiration to me for a very, very long time, starting with his writings from death row in his very first book, Live from Death Row. And Mumia and I were talking about another documentary that I had asked him to do some recordings for called Murder Incorporated, Empire, Genocide, and Manifest Destiny. And he recorded 25 brilliant answers to 25 questions that I gave him. And unfortunately, I just couldn't get my arms around the documentary. We were attempting to tell the 500-year story of the Euro-American march across the continent and the building of the American Empire. Try to get all of that in an hour and a half, and you're one heck of a filmmaker. And we've decided to do it as a book, actually, and we are co-authoring this book together right now, and it's been one of the real joys of my life. But out of those recording sessions came the idea of focusing the camera completely on the life of Mumia Abu-Jamal. You know, there's been a narrative told about Mumia over the 30 years since he was convicted of killing Philadelphia patrolman Daniel Faulkner, and the narrative, quite frankly, has been 50% lies and 50% gibberish. And as a storyteller, I wanted to really look at the man. The arc of his life, Dr. West, is so much wider, as you know, than December 9th, 1981. Here was a 15-year-old revolutionary writing for the Black Panther newspaper, attempting to change the name of his school to Malcolm X High School. By the late 70s, he was a rising talent in the Philadelphia radio market as a journalist. He was working for National Public Radio, all things considered, and his life gets snuffed out from under him the beginning of the 1980s. But he doesn't stop because, as you and I know, he is a long-distance revolutionary. And from death row, he has published 7 or 8 books, more than 3,000 recorded and written essays. It's a remarkable, remarkable narrative and a true story of courage and commitment. And that's the story I wanted to tell. And the folks that came to the table to be interviewed shared their love, shared their passion for a man who really has had a great impact on political and social discourse all over the planet.
And you say the premiere in New York City just a few days ago resulted in the, what would you say, the third?
Number 3 in the country for independently released films, which is really something. You know,
wow.
99.5% of all feature documentaries don't even make it into the theaters. And the fact that we're opening in New York, Los Angeles, and a host of other cities across the country is a real testament, I think, to Mumia's story. People in New York really embraced his story. And this weekend, we have another week ahead of us. We actually got extended for another week based on the business that we did in Greenwich Village at the Cinema Village. So, folks, I encourage you to go and see this film because the audience it's a real interactive experience. And we had some question and answer periods after the film, and it was really a moment in my life to be able to share Mumia's life with these folks because they embraced it with every ounce of love in their body.
Mm-hmm. Well, I saw the review in the New York Times. They were actually glowing in terms of both Brother Mumia Abu-Jamal's voice, but also the voice of towering figures like Dick Gregory and Alice Walker and Michelle Alexander. Tell us how you weave these various voices together to keep the narrative going in your film.
Well, during the research stage, I really wanted this film to be a journey with Mumia Abu-Jamal and not a journey with Stephen Vittoria because that'd be a very short movie. So I tried to read folks that have written about Mumia, people that meant a great deal to him, people that meant a great deal to the Black liberation movement and to the historical context of what I attempted to put Mumia's story inside of. The film is primarily obviously about Mumia's story, but it's also part of the incredibly racist structure of the city in Philadelphia, and of course across the entire United States, and what Mumia and other revolutionaries like him have had to deal with. So through the research and through his writings, I was able to assemble a cast of folks that really helped to weave the narrative. And they were people that were well known and famous. They were people that were not well known and famous. And I have a lot of incredible folks in this cast, yourself included, Dr. West. And my favorite interview, and I think you'll probably understand this, was Mumia's sister, Lydia Barashenko, who passed away just 2 months after we interviewed her. But she was so instrumental in cementing Mumia's legacy as a young man, because it was important to me for folks to understand how deep and how intelligent, how sophisticated this man was in his teens and in his 20s. And she did a wonderful job of isolating where he gets his spirit from and where he gets his love from. As you and I know, revolutionaries are always guided by love, and Mumia is a prime example of that, and Lydia did a phenomenal job of explaining that.
I think one of the things that distinguishes your own work, this was true for the earlier work even on George McGovern, but especially this one on Mumia Abu-Jamal, that they're not isolated individuals. They're in context. They're in family. They're in social movements. You got the MOVE movement, our dear sister Pam Africa, of course, and the whole comrades that helped shape him, the Black Panther Party, another context, journalism, the black journalist tradition, the prophetic journalist tradition, I.F. Stone on the one hand, T. Thomas Fortune on the other. Mumia's variety of contexts are all at work in this film. And how do you account for your own sensibility of not viewing these figures in a narrow, individualistic way, but rather understanding them in terms of historical context?
Well, I think any good story, there has to be a backstory. There has to be context, or it becomes very, very one-dimensional. Looking at George McGovern, as you mentioned, I had to delve deeply into the Vietnam War, because to understand George McGovern, you have to understand the history, the 2,000-year history of the Vietnam War and what was happening to the folks in Southeast Asia. With Mumia, it was the same thing. It was important to know, as Brother Jacob Lawrence taught us about the Great Migration, it was important to know where Mumia's family came from in the American South, why they came to Philadelphia, what was going on in Philadelphia at the time between Frank Rizzo and Ed Rendell and the other just completely draconian establishment in Philadelphia that Mumia grew up in and railed against and, thank God, fought against. It's one of the reasons I brought in a number of his brothers from the Black Panthers Party, because it was so important important to understand the impact that Reggie Shell and Barbara Cox Easley had on Philadelphia at the time. And we asked Angela Davis to come into the film because Angela really gave us just an incredible point of view of the female side of the Black Panther Party. And in Mumia's book, We Want Freedom, which is a brilliant book, he focused on that. So as a filmmaker, again, I was not trying to tell my story or my interpretation of Mumia, but I was trying to keep it as real as possible as to who the man was, and I wanted people there that were tangible and there was texture in his life, and I think we accomplished that tremendously.
Well, Angela Davis, of course, a giant herself, has been concerned about New Jim Crow and prison-industrial complex for decades now. She calls Mumia Abu-Jamal the 21st century Frederick Douglass. Tell us a little bit about that formulation.
Well, when you study Mumia and you study Frederick Douglass, who, by the way, I was in New York the other day, and I saw he was on the side of the New York Historical Society in the shadows, and Abraham Lincoln was on the front steps. I think you and I, Dr. West, have to campaign to move Douglass's statue to the front steps because that's where he belongs. He doesn't belong in the in the shadows on the side of the building. And when you study Frederick Douglass and you study Mumia, you see that there is an obvious connection. Mumia feels very deeply that he is channeling his ancestors. He is channeling the cries and pleas of generations of black slaves that he knows he's still speaking for right now. And I think Douglass is someone that Mumia embraces wholeheartedly. And when you read Frederick Douglass and you read Mumia Abu-Jamal, the similarities, almost the identicalness of some of the things that they write about is a little scary. In fact, in the film, I played with the audience a little bit, and on a couple of instances, I didn't tell them right off who was speaking. Was it Frederick Douglass? Was it Mumia Abu-Jamal? Was it the American, the budding American empire of the 19th century, or was it the full-scale American empire of the 21st century? And it's amazing how the names change and the wars change and the violence changes, but the critique of the American empire, whether it was Frederick Douglass, whether it was Mumia Abu-Jamal, Howard Zinn, it really is the same critique.
But would you agree that Brother Mumia's critique of capitalism is more intense and even more incisive than that of Frederick? I'm thinking of Frederick Douglass in Haiti as working in the U.S. consulate, and in that sense, in some ways, being a facilitator of U.S. policy vis-a-vis Haiti.
Right.
Whereas I could never imagine Brother Mumia Abu-Jamal working for the U.S. government in Haiti. You know what I mean?
No, I can't see that at all. And if you look at the arc of Mumia's work from his very first writings, which focused on mass incarceration and prison industrial complex, personal life in prison, his writing has grown, it has evolved, and the arc has aimed all of his critical eye at the U.S. government, at the American empire, and I think he's getting sharper and sharper as the years go on. I think he's hitting his prime, and his latest works have been just over the top. And I think his railing against class oppression, which you were getting at, is something that was carved into his psyche early on with the Black Panther Party, because as you and I know, a lot of what the Panthers were fighting against and fighting for was not necessarily racial equality, although that was a big piece of it, but it was class oppression.
That's right.
And that was something that really set the Black Panther Party aside from a lot of other movements, as they understood the power of predatory capitalism.
Absolutely. I mean, they were humanists at the core.
Yeah.
Humanists at the core, concerned about poor and working people across the board. I mean, Brother Bob Ovakian partly comes out of that tradition. He's got his own fascinating formulation, but humanists at the core in terms of ensuring that issues of gender and issues of sexual orientation and issues of skin pigmentation don't disfigure our perception of the class dynamics and the fundamental role that all human beings must play in terms of changing the world so that the least of these, the wretched of the earth, in the language of Franz Fanon, can live lives of decency and dignity. But in terms of your own individual life, though, Brother Steve, where were you born and how did you get to be such a loving and kind and courageous brother?
I was born in Newark, New Jersey. I grew up during the racial tension in Newark, New Jersey in the late 60s, and I was very fortunate. You know, I grew up in an Italian-American family, and on the one hand, an Italian-American family can be very beautiful, and I also, at the same time, saw some of the unfortunate racial ugliness that exists in the neighborhoods and in the families, things that were incredibly ugly to hear. And I was very fortunate to have a mother and father who were social democrats with a little d, and I remember my dad pounding his fist on tables with relatives during the so-called riots in Newark and telling folks it's not a riot, it's a revolution, and there's a reason we're having a revolution. And those moments stuck with me. And my mom's not with me anymore, but my dad is, and he's very proud of the Mumia film, and it's something that means a great deal to me. But I was very fortunate to have the education and to have the compassion and the love as a very young man to understand the dynamics that were going on out there and to embrace the people in my neighborhood and not fight them off as so many people were.
Well, this is our dear and beloved brother Steve Vittoria. He is a director of the new documentary Long Distance Revolutionary. Do not miss this classic. It's an instant classic. It's screening in a number of cities this month, including New York, Seattle, Miami. Did you say Los Angeles too, Russ?
Los Angeles on March 1st. New York
March
right
1st.
Now at Cinema Village this weekend and all next week.
Indeed. Thank you for your witness. Love and respect you, my brother.
Thank you. Love you too, Dr. West, and you are always an inspiration to me.
My dear brother, Mumia Abu-Jamal, how you doing, man?
My dear brother, Dr. Cornel West, how are you, sir?
Oh, you know I love and respect you, and we're sitting here talking with Brother Steve about this magnificent film. It's an instant classic, Long Distance Revolutionary, 21st Century Frederick Douglass, and you got a lot of Curtis Mayfield in you, too.
A whole lot of Curtis Mayfield, believe that. We're winner, and never let anybody say, girl, we can't make it. Come on now.
Well, feeble mind is in your way.
That's what I'm
Brother
saying.
Mumia. Brother, you are the freest man incarcerated in late modernity. You know that now. And
I have heard it. I have heard it. I'd rather
indeed.
be
I'm not
a
the
free
only one.
man in freedom than a free man in hell.
I hear you, though, brother. I hear you. But no, I know we don't have a whole lot of time, but I've been blessed to talk with you in New York and Princeton, and it's just a blessing to have you on the show. But what would you like to share with our audience, both in terms of the film, but also in terms of your magnificent work, your witness, your vision, your analysis, your text, as intellectual, as scholar, as activist, and as father and grandfather?
Wow, that's a big order, Dr. West. I don't know if you got enough time on your show. But I guess I want to say first that, it's a surprise and an honor to have the film done. As Steve Vittoria may have told you, this was not our original intention. I was part of another project, and the project didn't pan out. And Steve kind of intuited that another project, such as what was produced, was feasible and doable. And I had already written a lot, and we've done quite a bit of taping and talking over the phone. So he produced that project, really, and from everything I've heard, it is an extraordinary piece of work. I would love to see it one day, and as I suggested earlier, see it in freedom. But my work is a labor of love. I mean, it comes from things that move me, things that touch my heart, touch my spirit, touch my mind, things that intrigue me and things that fascinate me. So it's really about in essence, the most important concern for African people for the last 5 centuries, freedom. I wrote a book called We Want Freedom, one of the 10 points of the 10-point program of the Black Panther Party. But it didn't begin there, and damn it, it didn't end there when the party ceased to exist. And I think it is an irony that you said I'm one of the freest men you know, because, you know, while there's high tribute, of course, coming from Dr. Cornel West, it is also a statement of the lack of freedom that millions of men and women experience in quote-unquote freedom, that is, freedom outside of prison. As Malcolm famously said, don't be shocked when you heard I was in prison. Long as you south of the Canadian border, you in prison.
Another question, though. What is the role of the revolutionary like yourself in the age of Obama, though, brother?
I think that our role is fairly consistent with our history in this respect. I consider one of my heroes, and I'm sure one of yours, the great, the remarkable, the brilliant Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass knew freedom not as an illusion or anything as we know it today. He knew it viscerally because he also knew what it meant to be a captive. I prefer the term captive to slave. And he fled freedom. He escaped freedom, you know, with his first wife. And so he knew what freedom was worth because he had lived in his youth and his young manhood in unfreedom. But think about Frederick Douglass and his life as a revolutionary journalist.
From the State Correctional Institution at Mahanoy and is subject to monitoring and recording.
As a revolutionary journalist and editor for the North Star, he gave Abraham Lincoln hell. I mean, when you read what he wrote about Abraham Lincoln and his statements about Lincoln, they were not stinging, they were burning. He criticized him relentlessly. And by so doing, he moved him from the position of centrist, shall we say, or even center-rightist, you dig, or unionist, to a word that he never would have considered as applicable to himself, and that was a quasi-abolitionist. You know, you remember that when Lincoln spoke at Cooper Union in New York, he criticized John Brown as a crazy person. He considered abolitionists the lowest of the low, but they were activists, and they were not trying to be popular. They were trying to move this country from a slave nation to a free nation, and they raised holy hell. And Frederick Douglass was among the most persistent with his writing, with his speeches, and his biting criticism. So, as Frederick Douglass said, you know, we need more light right now. And he gave it to them. And we need to do the same thing now to the administration because, you know, I was talking to a group of friends the other day, and I was just ruminating on a piece that I wanted to write. And it was, I don't want to spoil it, but think about this. The end of this administration will come like a blink of an eye. You know, the first one went quickly. This will go quickly. What would the world look like for black America when there's no longer a black president in the United States? Will they have anything to celebrate other than the presence and the beautiful symbol? I mean, the family is beautiful. Hell, the president is beautiful. But what will black Americans have to show for it? Will our schools be any better? You know, will we still be the denizens of a prison industrial complex? Will we have the highest joblessness of any community in America? And will we have lost more personal wealth than any other community between blacks and Latinos, than any other segment of the American family, the American population? We have to have more than symbol. And I understand that politics is largely symbol. But, you know, when you think about that, it's a rather depressing thought. So our work is like Frederick Douglass's work, to raise as much holy hell as we can to change the direction of the empire.
Powerful. Give us your read on the drones, my brother. We got this debate on the drones, dropping bombs on innocent brothers and sisters in Somalia, Yemen, and Pakistan.
I wrote a piece a few weeks ago called "The Drone War Cometh," and you know, it was a statement about how technology has allowed war to be what is essentially a war game. There used to be a movie, I'm dating myself, but this was the early 80s, called War Games. And a little boy was playing with computers, and lo and behold, he was actually unleashing weapons in the real world. Well, we've reached that technological epoch where a man or woman can sit down at a computer console with a joystick in her or his hand and launch weapons thousands of miles and watch it like a video game, like a war game. But in fact, hundreds of innocent children and women, and men for that matter, and as is in the news today, American citizens of Arab descent for that matter, are wiped off the planet with a flick of a wrist. And we don't consider that war. I wonder if we considered it war if another nation did that to American citizens, saying, well, we have the right to do that. They're a threat to us. Think about all of the countries that the United States has invaded in the history of the Republic or the Empire. And then think about all the other people in those countries.
This call is from the State Correctional Institution at Mahanoy and is subject to monitoring and recording.
Who would like to strike back. I mean, drones are perfect tools when they're in the hands of the empire. But the technology exists where small groups of people can utilize these tools. And I think the devastating effect, we will see that. We will see that. And it will shock us and amaze us. But just like 9/11 shocked us and amazed us, your colleague, Chalmers Johnson, called it blowback. We are creating blowback right now with the drone wars. And we can't see it now because, we're Americans. But we couldn't see 9/11 on 9/10. But I assure you, it will come.
Well, Brother Malcolm talked about chickens coming home to roost and reaping what you sow, and what's in the wash will come out in the rinse.
There it is. There it is.
Indeed. One personal question. I know we're winding down, but I've always wanted to ask this, and we're going to have much more time. As you know, Chris Hedges, James Cone, and myself, we're going to get a chance to finally see you, though, brother, and I'm going to give you a hug. You know that.
That's what I'm talking about. I can't wait, brother.
I can't wait, though, brother. Just hoping that the Holy Ghost sustain me long enough to get me there. But what is your relation to prophetic Christianity, man? Because you've got such a subtle mind and your deep spirituality is undeniable. Were you shaped in the church, or give us a little sense of that?
I was shaped in two churches. That's because, like a lot of families, my mother and father didn't live together. But I would go to my mother's Baptist church, and I would go to my father's Episcopalian church.
Oh, that's a nice juxtaposition there, brother.
So you can imagine I was a little confused as a little boy because it was like walking into two different worlds. One was real formal and, ritualistic, and the other was down home, with,
absolutely.
Country people. So, but it gave me, insight to the spirits of black people and how diverse our spiritual life really is. And I think it was a good thing in that it opened me up to other experiences as opposed to being locked into one or two or three or a dozen. So, as I wrote in Faith of Our Fathers, for black people, so often our religion, to quote Du Bois, was no one worshiped freedom more than the Negro people because no one needed it more than us. So, religion was one of the places we could go and be human, have family, have community, have communion. And I think we still have those needs because guess what? We still ain't free.
We still ain't free. Good God Almighty. Good God Almighty.
Come on now.
Indeed. What would be your fundamental word, and I know we're coming to an end, what would be your fundamental word to the precious and priceless young brothers and sisters of all colors, but disproportionately on the brown side of town, for them to become part of this caravan of love linked to serious, progressive, and revolutionary vision and action?
You have 60 seconds remaining.
That they were born for this, that our people have only made movements forward when we became part of something greater than ourselves, when we became part of organizations, movements, communities moving together. And once that occurs again, not just our community, but the nation and the world can move forward. That day must come again. I feel it in my bones, and I know you do
You have
too.
30 seconds remaining.
No, I can feel it. I can feel it, and I can guarantee you that your writings, your work, your vision, your witness is an integral part. You remember Garvey said, "I'm coming back in the whirlwind."
In the whirlwind.
And in the whirlwind, but that whirlwind is gathering, and I tell you, Brother Mumia Abu-Jamal is an element in that whirlwind, and we all trying to get in on it, keeping the love going and making sure we are always accountable and self-critical, but most importantly, that we keep that love going. Stay strong, though, brother.